Hello, everyone. We are back from commercial break. I am one of your co hosts for this weekend, Abby Sherlock. So, I am super excited to welcome our first deep dive of the weekend. That is product management with Shaw Raman. Shaw is a organizational coach at Mojang where he works with leadership and teams to find sustainable ways to work, set ambitious goals, and deliver super fun experiences in all things Minecraft. His experience in the game industry spans from QA to production and product management. He's always up for helping others that want to get into the industry to further their current career and welcomes anyone to reach out based on today's talk or other topics. So sweet. You can submit your questions at any time by typing command question in Twitch chat, which will bring up a form for you to submit your questions. Those in Discord can be on the lookout for a form and panel announcements. And without further ado, please welcome Shaw.
Hello. Thanks for having me, everybody. Super excited to talk to you today about building a product managed portfolio. We know that multiple disciplines out there, whether it's engineering, design, etc., have really easy ways to talk about their work. And in product management, you're usually left with telling stories about things that you've worked on. And so we're going to look at a way to kind of take some of your experiences and get that into a format that you can share, whether that's along with your resume for interviews, etc. So we'll start today with a little bit about me. So my name is Shah Rahman. I'm currently at Mojang working as an organizational coach, working with leadership across our games, across some of our technology teams, on various parts of kind of the agile mindset, delivering content to players as often as we can, as well as more internal things like setting goals. Right? How do we as teams set goals for ourselves? How do we make progress? How do we convey that to other groups? And previously, I've worked at other places like Riot Games. You see my Timo main right here with Yasuo as backup. I was a development manager in that space, also kind of doing similar work that I am today. But also spent some time working on 2D and 3D content, as well as some game features. And then for Blizzard, where I've spent most of my time throughout the last decade, I've worked as a product manager, kind of in the web R&D space, in online community health, and then as well, kind of transition through the world of production and program management as well. And I got my start in QA, so lots of really cool experiences along the way. And that's what helped me kind of realize by working with all these disciplines that we as product management folks, whether we're in college or just aspiring to be a product manager or coming from another industry or another job, another discipline, it's definitely doable to have a portfolio that shows your work, even if you haven't been in that job yet specifically. And I know that's a difficult piece for everyone to get into. Let's get into the next slide. All right. So first and foremost, all of the views that you're going to get today are personal, right? They don't represent Mojang, Blizzard, Riot, any of the other folks that may talk about. It's all coming from me, but I did get learning from all of those places. So you're going to get like an amalgamation of a bunch of really cool stuff that I've learned from all the great people working there over the years. So in building a product managed portfolio, um, how does someone begin to prepare their portfolio for interviews? That's kind of the first place you're likely going to share it. Is when somebody says, "Hey, go ahead and send your interview package in or your submission package in, your resume, et cetera, et cetera." It's up to you to also throw in a portfolio. You can add that as a link to your resume, depending on how you go, or you could show up to an on-site with your portfolio printed out if you need to. A few case studies and things like that from it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're also going to talk about kind of what companies are looking for along the way as I explain some of these to you. Cool. And you may be wondering kind of what's up with the cat, right? So some of the people that signed up for this talk, they came in kind of with an understanding of what to expect, right? We're going to talk about building portfolios as a product manager or an aspiring product manager. But what that cat does is it captures everybody else that wasn't in that mindset yet. And it says, okay, like I'm paying attention. This is something different. I didn't expect it. It's a cat. Now, you don't have to go put cats all over your portfolio, but you do need a hook. You need something that When people come to your portfolio, when they look at your resume, you have to catch people's eyes. And it doesn't always have to be a visual thing. You can make a bold statement, right? So, a lot of the things we're going to talk about today is you just taking that extra step and really going all in on building this portfolio and making some bold statements in it as well, even if you haven't been in that position yet. And that's going to show that you have kind of the thought process, even if you haven't gone and done that exact type of work they're looking for yet. So let's go to the next slide where we're going to talk about kind of picking your platform. So everybody watching this today can start right now. You have free platforms all over the place. None of the stuff I'll talk about is sponsored by any of these platforms. So like building a personal website, Squarespace, Wix, any of those spaces, you don't have to worry about the coding. If you're not an engineer and you're not trying to show off your programming skills, no need to program your own site, right? Same with design. If you're not a designer, no need to design your own site. You can just focus on the content. Yeah, and in the world of product management, while you may be doing prototypes and things like that, you know, uh, most of the time I'm not looking for a product manager to program or design specifically. So going with something like LinkedIn to kind of level up what your content is, taking that content, putting it on a personal website, or even speaking to it if you're more comfortable in front of the camera or even in audio, putting it on YouTube, right? You can take your content that's built for a portfolio and present it in a modern way that's easily accessible. And that's why I have these three up here. Is anyone in the world can access these three spaces um, with an asterisk for China and YouTube, obviously. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So a lot of you with educational backgrounds, right? When I speak to you, you talk a lot about what you're studying, right? And you leave it off there. And what I'm going to promote right now is as you build a portfolio, whether it's a website talking about LinkedIn or even talking face to face, tailor your background to what you're trying to get into, right? So instead of saying I'm currently in my fourth year, you know, taking a degree in cool stuff at Get Good University, right? You could say I am this major and I'm interested in working on products that expand how players socially interact with each other in emerging digital spaces. So you've talked at the beginning about kind of your educational background, and then you're following through by connecting it to, as this educational background person, this academic person, I want to translate my experience and knowledge into this field. So that's first and foremost. So when you bring that up in any part of your portfolio, usually like an About Me page or an About Me section, make sure to make that connection. And what this is also going to mean, excuse me, similar to your resume, is you may have multiple versions of this to tailor the different spaces you want to work within. So don't be afraid to do that either. Make multiple versions of your portfolio just like you would your resume. It is going to take some work. So let's go into the next slide. So a lot of you will be coming in with various types of experience, right? And if you look at two buckets right now, you could come in with subject matter experience, which is kind of taking experience and knowledge that you already have in a field and synthesizing it into what's next, whether it's for a product, a service, or even a company, right? You could also be coming in with user experience, right? Like I have 1,000 hours in Destiny and I'm gonna go work on an FPS game, right? I'm gonna have a deep understanding of the problem space that FPS games solve for the player from a product perspective and for players within it, like all sorts of problems that they may deal with within PvE, PvP, systems design, things like that, right? The hint at the bottom says, you kind of need both for a good product team. So across the company, you would want people with subject matter expertise and user experience, right? People that are going to champion kind of what the player is dealing with. So that's why I'm calling this out. You can have either, you can have both, but the way you're going to talk about it in your portfolio is going to need to be specific in such a way that you show that you're ready to work in a team environment with this expertise. So let's look at the next slide to kind of talk about that a little bit. So Similu is sitting here in this room, right? He needs to show that he's a good SME within a collaborative group, right? So you won't just be the subject matter expert that gets hired in as a product manager and like you're just in a room making decisions all day. People just open the door and say like, "Hey, what should we do with our product?" You say, "Do X, ship it," and then that happens. Like That's not the case. Most of the time, you're going to be trying to convince people. So if Simi Lu, in this case, as the product manager, the person to his right is probably a design expert with tons of experience as to what the player experience is in the game you're trying to get into. And the person on the left could be the engineer that has deep technical expertise in terms of what systems exist, what are the capabilities, how viable is it to build a solution, right? So even if you're the subject matter expert, you have to show that you're collaborative. So a hint I'm going to give you down the line here in this talk today is to go ahead and start building those teams, right? Get some friends that are in the same boat as you. If you're a product manager or an aspiring product manager, you probably have some friends that are aspiring engineers, aspiring designers. Get in groups with them. Try some of these things out that I'm going to tell you today as a group, and then make this case study. And at the end of it, you may have three different portfolios for three different people, right? If not more. Uh, the next one is a little bit counterintuitive sometimes. It's really important in an interview to kind of keep things succinct, right? Your answers. If somebody says like, "Hey, how would you solve this problem?" You may do a star method of, here's the situation, here's the task at hand, here's the actions I took, and here's the results I'd expect. And kind of, offer it that pitch of information. But in a portfolio, you get to go deeper. And what I'm looking for in a portfolio is how how deep can you dig into a problem that came up during development, right? And what did you do specifically in your role? And how did you impact the other roles around you? Because that is where a product manager is going to shine. In a lot of cases, you're not just there saying like, "Hey, here's my vision for this product. Here's the strategy. Let's talk to the engineer about how we're going to do it, or the designer about how it's going to feel to the user." Right? You're going to have to kind of be there for all of those discussions. That means when a problem comes up, you're going to have to go reach out and talk to many different people to solve it, and that's an example that you're not going to get usually until you get on a team and try it out. So again, as a part of making this portfolio, I recommend making these little teams with your friends, or even people you're going to college with right now, and trying some of this stuff out. The last one is taking a stance on a relevant topic and being able to back it up. So let's look at it from a subject matter expert here, right? You're coming in, you're trying to work on a game. Let's say it's an MMO. It's got PVE, PvP, and you're making a big statement about how PvP and PvE systems should work. Now you may be talking to people or sharing your portfolio with people that have been doing this for decades. So there's definitely that pressure of like, oh my gosh, like, am I gonna just look stupid by making a statement or taking a stance? It's like, no, no. If you can back up what you're thinking and show the thought process, that is going to be super valuable to show kind of how you'll work within that team. And so in a portfolio, it's okay to take that stance when you choose or prioritize some solutions to a problem. And don't worry if you're having a hard time conceptualizing this. We're going to go through a specific example at the end here. So if you're actually trying to prioritize, you're going to be thinking about a lot of different things. And sometimes you, as the product manager, have to take a stance, right? And then be able to back it up. So you want to back that up with quantitative and qualitative data, right? Qualitative data by talking to players, by looking at how players feel, how they're thinking. Quantitative data and what actions are they taking today, right? And you in a group of 10,000 people on a Discord server have access to quantitative data, whether you think about that or not. So we're gonna talk about some examples there. So enough on that one. Let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk about now, as an experienced user, what are you bringing to the table, right? In the context of building a portfolio, if you're an experienced user, you're bringing a ton of insights from the ground level, from the player perspective. And as much as game developers like to kind of hear from players and see what players are doing, data from players as well, and play the game themselves, it is super tough to truly understand what players are dealing with sometimes. Because from a game dev perspective, you're getting a ton of data. And sometimes little pockets of data is super useful to have from little groups of people that give you nice anecdotal experience and just deeper amounts of information. So when you're coming in from an experienced user perspective, you're going to champion the user experience, right? So in your portfolios, when you're creating, let's say, a story or use UX case study type thing, and you're kind of going through a situation and you're having to prioritize, you're definitely prioritizing for the user experience. And the reason for that is you can offer way more details as to why you chose something for the user experience. You can offer way more details as to what the user, what the player is going through. So if you extend this now to like, okay, I've given my portfolio to somebody as a very experienced user in the game that I'm applying to be a part of, if they ask me a question, I'm going to offer a ton more details, taking the user experience focus, taking the player focus on my solutions. The second one is, identify when you're making an assumption. It's okay to say like, hey, I'm gonna make an assumption that these players in this PvP case that we're thinking about right now would likely do X. That assumption is being taken because of these three details. Like, be able to back it up, right? But identify that something is an assumption versus saying like this is a fact. Like I have data for this, it's right here. Right. So identify and validate assumptions. The other part of this is as an experienced user, you're going to help the team validate and identify assumptions as well. So it's easy to be doing this work 40 hours a week and be thinking like, yeah, I kind of know what's going on from a design, technology, or product perspective. Like I live this stuff 40 hours a week, right? But you need to understand when you're making an assumption as a team. So you coming in as a product manager that has a ton of user experience in the game itself are going to be able to say, I think that's an assumption. Like, do we have data to back that up? And you can do it respectfully without, challenging someone's character. Okay, so the last one, leverage qualitative data. So there's a good bit of quantitative data out there nowadays because it's relatively I want to say known now how to set up telemetry and start getting data from what players are doing in games. But qualitative data is still pretty difficult. You can send out surveys, but you're not going to get a response from every single player. Whereas you can set up a piece of an action in a game and track data around how players take that action, and you're going to get that from everybody playing the game. So qualitative data is a little bit more difficult, but again, with you coming in from a user perspective, you're going to understand, a little bit more in detail what types of players exist, what types of groups exist, and you're going to be able to apply that in your work. Okay, still in the concept space, let's go to the next slide. We're now starting to get a little bit more practical around like, okay, what do I do? Like, I get it. I need a portfolio. I have different ways of doing it. The first thing is you need content. Again, as I said, we can be very design or engineering heavy as product managers, but that's not what we're here to offer in the portfolio. We're here to offer content, right? We're here to offer stories. We're here to offer case studies of how we solved a problem or even how we did research on a problem and realized we had, a bigger issue. So kind of what I want to dig into in this slide is figuring out that there are problems that can be solved and that you have the ability to go and solve them with people that are not in that game team right now. You can go have a group that is within the Discord space that you're in right now, for example, in a game, and you can ask them what their biggest problems are. And you can start digging into like, hey, can I test some of these problems out? Can I understand them a little bit deeper? Can I get a group of people and test out maybe some potential solutions by playing the game differently and getting that data and then presenting an outcome from that? Like that's what I'm talking about here, right? So we know all the games we play have problems in one space or another, otherwise they wouldn't be, continually developed. So figure out some of those problems, pick the ones that you're really into, and then start from there. The second one is company problems. Companies are driven by people, right? The company isn't an entity by itself. And as a product manager, sometimes you'll be digging into company problems like, hey, it looks like this product is stagnant. How do we fix it? How do we bring it back to life? How do we modernize it for the modern crowd today? Or even shift our target audience to another set of players that really want to play the game, but they can't? How do we solve for that, right? So try to figure out those problems. And right now, just be in the space of identifying. If we go on the next slide, I'm going to tell you how to kind of take the next steps now. Now that you've identified some of the problems you want to dig into, find some systems, find some processes that people are using in the industry today I'm going to show you two that I love. We have the circles method, which is actually what we're going to apply to our example kind of portfolio project today. And it helps you comprehend the situation by breaking down the problem in various different ways. You're going to identify different, player groups. You're going to report kind of what their each individual types of needs are. You're going to prioritize those needs in the way that suits the problem that you're trying to solve. You're going to list out a few solutions, test them out, evaluate the trade-offs, talk about kind of what's the return on investment for the player in continually engaging with this new system you're proposing, return on investment for the company, etc. And then you're going to summarize a recommendation. That's a huge a core loop of what a product manager does. The other one on top is really cool too. It's a double diamond. It's a design approach. You have to have a lot of empathy towards the players, right? So this method is super awesome because you go between research and design constantly, and you refine as you go. And that's another really cool method. I'm not going to dig into how these work in detail here. You can YouTube this. There's people that have done awesome jobs at breaking these down and also offering really cool examples. And another really cool hint here is actually look for other people, other product managers, and look for their portfolios as well. And you'll see some of these popping out. And look for designers as well and engineers as well, because we know that sometimes product manager positions are, very leaning heavily towards either design or engineering. So how do I apply this? Let's go into the next slide. I want to take a pause here and just acknowledge there's a lot to do if you're going to go create a portfolio. It is not something you're going to get done overnight. And it's honestly something you're going to look at and think, I wish I had done this like either years ago or months ago or weeks ago. That's totally okay. Like you're going to continue doing super cool work, and there's going to be opportunities for you to have more portfolio worthy projects. But for now, the best thing to do, like we said on the second slide, was just start, right? Set up one of those portfolio sites, and then get going. So let's see how we can pull it all together now, and we'll go to an example on the next slide. These are the heaviest text slides. No need to read this. This is for you who come back to the VOD and pause. This is for you that maybe get access to this presentation in one way or the other. So no need to read this line by line. I'm going to kind of present this to you, right? Let's say now we're creating order out of all this chaos, and we're creating a portfolio. On that portfolio, we're going to create a case study. What this case study is going to do is going to say, here's a problem that's presented. We're going to break it down. We're going to talk about who's involved, how they're dealing with it, what their needs are, prioritizing kind of the various aspects of that for our needs as a product manager. And then we're going to set up some hypothesis and some tests, good old scientific method. And then the next slide will go over a little bit more into kind of what we're doing. But in this slide, I want to dig into it a little bit. So first, you're breaking down the problem. On the top left is where I am right now. Players find it difficult to optimize gear for survivability in PvP. So pick a game where you have this contact deeply, right? Let's start thinking about that. Like, why are they having this problem? There's too many options for gear, too many different ways to get gear. Primary versus secondary stats on gear can be confusing as to what helps me survive the most. Class specializations now optimize different secondary tertiary stats. Primary functionality of the class versus the utility you bring to the group. And then finally, like survivability through gear. All this stuff adds into this problem. And they're not negative things, they're just parts of the complexity that is the game. So that's what you're trying to break down here. And in the portfolio, you're going to take each of these bullets and you're going to write a little bit about it. Right? So you're right now you're trying to dig into the problem. So again, I recommend doing this as a group. Get your group together, pick a game, pick a problem such as this, and have those sub bullets and write a little bit. Talk about it. What is the problem actually? Then move on to kind of the who and how of what's happening, who's involved, right? So personas are great. Think of them as like categories of players that you have in the game that are kind of motivated by different things, right? In this case, you may have, in the context of the problems we set up above, you may have players leveling through PvP. So all they care about is just surviving and having fun while they're getting experience or maybe maximizing experience. Freshly level capped players that are getting into PvP and getting wrecked because they don't have the gear. Uh, players playing with friends that may be much better or worse than them and how that can impact their mentality and motivations. Solo players, right? Like I don't have anybody to lean on. I'm a warrior. I don't have any pocket healer. I'm just getting wrecked left and right. How do I do it? Or how do I survive by myself? And then lastly, like competitive. I want to optimize, right? Like I want to be unkillable in this game, right? Like how do I optimize for survivability? All these different players have different needs. And so as you get into the needs section in the center of the slide here, you're going to start validating assumptions. Like, what am I assuming about these players versus what is the reality? If you take that last example of the competitive player that wants to be unkillable, what aspects of that are an assumption that you're making versus the reality? Go to a PvP, subreddit and ask the question. Go to a Discord channel and ask the question. You may have 800,000 people ready to answer that question for you, and that's a ton of data for you to look at, right? So set up interviews, whether it's on Discord, a one-on-one, wear a mask, social distance, hashtag gets vaccinated, right? Reddit surveys, like you can set up a lot of cool ways to get this data for yourself. You don't need to be part of game team, and you don't need to have access to a huge like arsenal of kind of data and UX specialists to run tests and labs for you. You can do this today. The next one is kind of translating all those needs to user stories. Now, user story simply said is kind of how you take a need for a user and you structure it in such a way that easily allows a development team to break it down. All right, so as a solo player, I want to learn how to optimize my gear for survivability so that I can win more matches. Right? In there, who this kind of need is coming from. It's a solo player. What are they trying to do? They're trying to learn how to optimize their gear for survivability. So why? Like why? Why are they trying to do that? So they can win more matches. So you can kind of get an idea of like kind of how to structure these needs now to help prioritize, which is the next step, right? And when you're prioritizing, get with your group again, get their perspectives because an engineer and a designer is going to give you different perspectives than the product person, right? And get an idea of like what are we prioritizing according to? What do we care the most about? Is it the impact the changes we propose are going to make on the game itself, to the player base, to player sentiment? Like, how much players trust us? Like, are we going to make a change that loses player trust, and make us think we're putting them on guide rails if we make the system too easy to optimize for survivability? Like, what's the ROI estimates? And that's a real question. That's not just thinking about money. This ROI is like, what kind of team am I going to need to build the solution that I'm proposing? Do we have that team? Do we have the skill set? And then the same from the player perspective, you can do an ROI as well. Like if a player is really struggling right now in PvP because they can't survive and we implement this change, what's their return on investment to keep on playing? What do they get out of it? Right? So think about that from multiple perspectives. And then finally, like complexity. We create this solution and do these hypotheses and tests. Are we adding complexity? Are we removing complexity? What's the goal here? Right? So again, there's a lot to keep in mind. So if you have more people in this group that you're working with to create this portfolio, it just gets a little bit easier each time, because you can spread the workload and you get different perspectives. So you're not thinking like halfway through, like, man, am I blind to like all these other perspectives, or am I blind to something that I'm just not thinking about right now? So next one is a big one, uh, hypothesis and tests. Right, scientific method. Like we have multiple ideas. Some of those ideas are testable, some of them are not. Pick the ones that are testable and go test them. So let's look at it. I'm in a PvP game, let's say something like Destiny, and I'm proposing that we do stat simplification. Cool, look at all the stats in Destiny. Which one is about survivability? Is it recovery? Is it resilience? Do we need to simplify that into something different, right? Like, then look at gear optimization filters, right? Like, hey, maybe when you go to a vendor to get gear, maybe we give them filters for survivability and DPS and healing rather than class. So maybe we switch it to roles, right? Or maybe we set up some experiments across the board. Now, how do I set up an experiment for a game I'm not a developer for? This is the fun part. So this is where you can kind of now put on the UX hat or the designer hat as a product manager and say, cool, like, how do I get someone to play a game in a specific way that I need them to play without me changing the code in the game? You can set some ground rules up. right? You can set up gear sets and you can have people try them on. WoW is another cool one to test this in as well, right? You can set up gear sets for people. You can have them run 10 BGs. So how was that? How'd your character do with this gear set, right? Like jump on a PTR, make a character copy. Super easy to test this stuff out, right? Now, multiply that by 20 people, you run it across on Discord. What kind of experimental data did you get from that? So let's look in the next slide. There's a lot of cool ways. I love the experimental part because I love testing different ideas out. And you don't necessarily need to change the code in the game to do it. Sometimes you just have to change the rules of the game a little bit and kind of run that study yourself. So next we'll jump into kind of evaluating trade-offs. So you've broken down the problem. You've identified, in the last slide, you've identified the types of users you have. You've taken those users and said, okay, what are their needs specifically, and how do those needs kind of tie to different priority systems that we have? Whether it's gameplay, balance, etc. And then you said, what matters the most to us, right, to test right now? What kind of hypotheses do we have that are testable that we want to go with right now? Go test that, right? Let's say you test that and now you have data. You have a few ideas of your tests, you have data. Evaluating trade-offs is the next step. So stat simplification. What impacts does that have? What if when you did stat simplification, it impacted how PvE players looked at the game, how they looked at that gear? What if it created a whole new opportunity for a type of player that you didn't even think about, right? So if it impacts PvE, maybe in this case you say, you know what, no thanks. I don't want to mess with that right now. Let's cut that, right? This is a real process you're going to go through with the team. So this is a great process to practice. Next one, gear optimization filter. It showed lower deaths for survivability set users across the board. Each 10 battlegrounds or each 10 matches that players played with those survivability sets, they did better on in terms of KDA, especially their deaths reduced by X%, right? You take that and you say, okay, let's go forward with that one, right? Next one, you're summarizing. So you've gone through to test, and this process, like on a dev team, may take months. It may take a year or years in some cases, depending on what you're trying to solve. But ideally, as a product manager, I try to make these cycles as small as possible to optimize for learning and getting things out to players faster, so they can kind of give us feedback and we can get that data again. But let's say now you have all this data, you need to summarize, because now as a product manager, this is where you come in and now you're pitching this to design, to engineering, to different parts of the organization. Can we do this? Again, that ROI discussion of like, do we even have a team that's available to do this while we're trying to create everything else, right? So let's summarize this as, we're teaching players how to optimize gear for survivability in PvE or PvP. You've restated the problem state, right? Next one is adding gear vendor filters, right? That's one of the methods that we tried. Next one, adding gear sets to optimize for healing, DPS, and survivability. And then we tested with 10 different groups. You're presenting the data, right? Then at the end, you really want to pick something. Take that stance, like I said before, right? Which method do you want to go forward with? This is now kind of like the other side of the coin for product management that you're going to get into. So on a portfolio, you're showing that you can get to this point. The next parts you really have to get to an organization with, because now you're pitching, you're getting feedback from various different groups, you're getting feedback from players. That's a really cool experience you'll get, but I'm not going to expect you to get that coming in as a product manager. That's what you'll get on the job, right? But if you're able to do something like this process right here, especially in the game you're trying to get into, like that shows a huge amount of thought and insight that you can bring to the table, not only as an individual, but like to the group. And kind of one little bonus, this is a good thing I like to think about in interview questions as well as something like a portfolio. Have a little section where you talk about like, why did you go with the route you did versus others, right? So like players like primary and secondary stats in PvE. So we didn't go with that, right? We didn't do stat simplification. Second one, vendor filter showed players, bought more focused gear sets. So that means like when we introduced those filters, players were receptive to it. They started buying more. They weren't just randomly buying gear that looked good. Now, the last one is lower death count across all personas that use the filters and gear sets. Like that's why we chose it, right? This is another example of what you go through, because when you propose and you pitch, kind of your idea with your group, you're going to get a lot of rebuttals, a lot of questions. It's like, why didn't you go with this method instead? You're going to have to be able to talk to them. So again, like having this, wonderful. So we'll finish this section out with a few tips. We're almost there. So gather up your group, right? And take on different roles. Go find some friends. You may have some researchers in there, some data scientists in there. You can create all sorts of different groups and try this out. And you're benefiting everybody. You're not just saying like, "Hey, do me a favor." Like everybody's getting this as an output of their product, right? Next one is use a real game to test your hypothesis. All right. So like I said, you can sit somebody down, watch them play a game, and tell them like, "Hey, you can do everything except use this gear or use this button." You can definitely change that area. Next one is leverage your communities like Discord, Reddit, game forums to run interviews and experiments. And then the last one is document your work because this now becomes your case study in a portfolio and kind of almost a template for what you can do in your next week. So moving on to the next slide, word heavy slides done. Thank you for hanging in there on that one. So in this slide, kind of it's a reminder, right? Be you. Experienced product managers that are going to be interviewing you are bringing knowledge, clarity, and focus to their teams. You, as a new product manager, aspiring one, right? You're bringing fresh perspective to the team. So your portfolio doesn't have to be quote unquote right. It has to be your perspective. It has to be your group's perspectives, right? And in the world of product management, there is no objective right often. Otherwise, we wouldn't have our jobs. Everybody would just be doing the objective right thing and then it'd be done, right? So it's definitely important to kind of stand by who you are here. Moving over to the next slide, just acknowledging that what you just did were building blocks. If you have an interview next, a situational question interview of like, tell me about a time you did X. Imagine how many answers you have now just from that one portfolio example that we did, right? Like working with that group, some of the problems you'll run into will be real examples you can use in these answers. And it's much better than saying, like, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question because I actually don't have experience working with dev teams yet. You can say, no, I work with this team. We try to develop a solution for this problem in our game. And this is what we ran into. This is what I did. This is what I learned. This is what I didn't do, X over Y. Like you have a lot of cool talking points now off of this. So in the next slide, that's pretty much the bulk of the content, right? There's a lot of content shared here. Just kind of reiterating, you can create your portfolio as a product manager, and it doesn't need to be this hugely epically designed or engineered portfolio. It can just have some case studies. 2 or 3 go a long way. All right, just 2 or 3 go a really long way. And somebody that wants to know a little bit more about you as a candidate, and maybe they visit it in like a second or third interview, but like that may be the reason they hire you versus not. So hit me up. I have some other stuff on leadingdevteams.com, like some other blogs about this similar stuff. And then you can DM me. My link right there is for LinkedIn. Hit me up if you have any questions. Yeah. And then the last slide, just kind of thanking Canva a little bit, right? This is not at all sponsored by them in any way, but this tool is super cool. So if you're getting into the world of portfolios, a little bit meta here, like this tool helped me create this slide deck in about 4 hours. So imagine if you're trying to create a portfolio now, these animations, the text, the images, it's all free. So like go look for these types of tools and start to get to know them and become more comfortable with them and start integrating that into your portfolio, right? Then a lot of the design and engineering stuff is done for you. So that's it.
Amazing. Woo, that was a lot. Learning like a lot, Shaw. Thank you so much.
Of course,
Well, you know what? We actually have some audience questions for you.
my
So you
favorite.
can't leave. Yes, you can't leave just yet. This is a really interesting one that I think really works fascinatingly with our last panel, which is can you talk about some of the differences between production, project management, and product management?
Yes, definitely. One of the
Yeah.
more common questions in our world, right? Like, what would you say you do here?
Yeah.
I like to use the analogy of like going to the beach or going to the concert. Let's choose some concerts this time, right? So if you think of a project manager, um, and they're setting up concerts, they're setting up like who's playing, they're setting up when they're playing, and they're working on a work back schedule from when the concert is to today, and all the critical path of things that need to happen in order to make that concert work and be awesome, right?
Yeah.
And they're the person that's gonna be ringing everybody's door and like hitting them up on email and Slack if something's broken along the way, right? That's the
Yeah.
project manager. Now think of like the program manager. That program manager is working with project managers across the board, working on all sorts of concerts throughout the whole year. So that program manager has like a wider view of kind of what's happening for projects, maybe in a region, right? Or maybe a
Yeah.
specific type of concert. Then you have a product manager that's like, why are these people going to concerts in the first place? Like, what do they get from it? Is it entertainment? Like, do they just want to see specific people? Do they just want to go have a social experience? And like, how do we optimize? Like, what's people's problems
Yeah.
when they go to concerts? What do they not have? What do they want? Do they want a better view? So they're constantly thinking about that and working with a project manager on the next concert to make little improvements. Right. So that's kind of like producer, project manager, program manager. Was there another one in there?
No, those were the 3, but I know those
Sweet.
terms get tossed around so much that people are like, "Huh?"
Yes.
And they mean different things at different companies.
Yes, they do. Yes. My example are from my kind of anecdotal experience. Yes.
Exactly. So got some cool audience questions, but what are some of your core responsibilities as an organizational coach for a game studio?
Oh, this is a new one. Like,
I
it's a super
know.
cool role, right? Like, I've never heard of this until coming over to Sweden, actually. So I've heard of like agile coaches and stuff like that, and that is kind of what I chalk this up to in terms of how I'm approaching it. But as an org coach, I may be working with like an executive producer one day on like how to set up goals for their group, right? Without being prescriptive to their
Mhm.
producers. And then on that same day, working with those producers on like, okay, how do I set up a strategic goal that aligns with like my group manager or my executives or the players, right? Like how do I manage all of this? And so like from a coaching perspective, I'm giving people plays, right? Like here's how you could go about doing this, or even reviewing some of their work. Like, hey, let's sit down and let's go through some of these goals ourselves, right? As well, like I might switch gears and say, like, oh, how do we solve this specific problem for players? Who do I need to get involved in this conversation? Grab those people and have that discussion with them. Or I may be brought into a discussion around a problem that players are having and, like, just offer my experience in there, right? Or coaching in there from like maybe how to set up teams to kind of best solve the problem or how to offer different perspectives or be the one in the room calling out assumptions, right? So it's a really interesting role where like I don't have a specific product or project that I'm accountable for, but I'm
Interesting.
accountable for like making sure that like the coaching part is there, right? People have someone
Yeah.
to go to get that support.
Love that. It's super interesting also getting a global perspective because like you said
Yeah.
in Sweden,
Yes.
knowing how different places work, which I think is really important with games being so global as they are.
Yes. Learning a lot. Everybody does games differently, but the problems end up being the same, which is really interesting.
It is. This one I think you kind of touched on a bit, but maybe going more in depth. But is how does a product manager work with a project manager? Do the two ever mix or cross over?
Yeah, honestly, I love it when they mix and crossover. It does happen, right? When you have an experienced project manager that's worked on executing a lot, right? They're going to have some really great insights into development and a lot more insights onto what a specific team is capable of. So they may be the one in the room kind of challenging the scope of a project, right? Or a scope of a change and say, like, this does seem like the best thing for the player, but I'm not sure our team can build it in time. Or I'm not sure our current team can build it, right? Like, so they're going to offer some really cool insights to the product manager that says, like, hey, I'm coming from a player perspective, a design, engineering, or organization perspective of this is what we need to do. And the project manager is going to like set them to reality as to
Reality,
whether it's doable.
you're coming back. Um,
Yes.
I love that. You need both, right?
You absolutely need both. And sometimes the same person is doing both, depending on where you are. Yeah.
We love that. This is an interesting one, actually. When designing a new feature and knowing you need to test for that feature, what are some of the questions you ask yourself to make sure you're testing for the right thing early in the development cycle?
Yes. Oh, that's so important to test
I
early.
know.
And it goes back to like some of the slides about like how can you test without getting engineers involved, without
Yeah.
getting like a huge amount of resources behind it. How can you test in a cheap way? Um, the first and foremost part is like taking the player perspective. I think,
Hmm.
the way you can test earliest is just in your mind. What are players going to think if we try something like this? If
Yeah.
that immediately is setting off alarms, like you need to go back to the drawing board and maybe not get ready to be in test mode yet and rethink like, am I solving the right problem? So that's one thing, right? Like get people involved, brainstorm of like potential impacts, but then actually trying to test a change. Uh, I was working at one point on like filtering technology,
Yeah.
and we were trying to think of different ways to capture other things that miss the filter sometimes. And I went and like tried Python and found some libraries that approach it differently, and I just spun it up on like a hackathon, and it helped me think a lot about kind of the problem and how we could solve it in different ways as a product manager, and then go send it off to the experts. Like, hey, engineers, like I tried these things out. It looked like it solved some of these. Is it scalable?
Yeah.
Does it fit with our overall approach to how we're architecting these solutions? Is it even valuable in the space of what you're thinking, right? So prototyping is another helpful thing there, whether it's like a paper prototype where you're like just sketching out how something might be, or in this case like me going and getting some Python libraries and trying it out, like trying to do filtering in different ways and getting insights from that, getting some real data and taking
Mm.
that back to the team. Like early prototyping is super good for that. Then after that, it's pretty much like finding out what are the testing paths. Like, does this game have a test branch that we can go ahead and maybe ask an engineer on the game to try out some of our assumptions, and can we do an internal play test on it? Right. But the best would be like try to make a small change, be honest with it with players, and get it out in some kind of like public test realm, snapshot, PTR, etc., and just be open. Like, hey, we're wondering what would happen if we did this. We'd love your feedback. Right. If you're in that boat, like golden.
I love that. You're also talking about, I know, prioritizing, right? Because like you said, you have to be like, oh, all of this is important. And it's like, yes, but some things got to get done before others, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a really good friend of mine told me once that priority is a singular term.
Yeah.
He's like, only recently have I seen priorities."
Yeah.
He's like, no, priority is the one main thing that's more important than anything else. So if you're looking for a priority, it's one thing. So have that one thing that you can prioritize. But then everything else needs to be interchangeable, right? So your number 2 through 5 need to be something that people are willing to shake on. If everything's number one, you're screwed. You're,
Yeah.
you're gonna miss either the timing, or you're gonna burn out your team, or the quality's gonna slip.
Yep. That's true, true, true. This is an interesting question, I think, about as a product manager, what other disciplines on the team are you regularly working with? How do you build good stakeholder relationships?
Oh, okay. So two different spaces.
I
So one
know.
is like who am I working with on the team? The second one is like good stakeholder relationships. So I'll start with the first one. It depends on the product,
Yeah.
right? So if I'm working on a heavy technology team, I'm likely interacting with a lot of engineers, a lot of QA, because engineers are architecting, they're creating, and QA
Yeah.
is testing. So I'm talking to both to see what that loop feels like, right? And getting a feedback loop in place there. Whereas like if I'm making a change in a game, right, it's going to be a little bit deeper. I'm going to go talk to UX to see like what is the player, it's called kind of like the affordance, right? Like what are we giving the player the capability of doing now, right? And then going talk to the visual designer. What does it look like? Go talk to the game designer. What does the system behave like? What are the inputs and outputs? Go talk to the engineer. Is this viable? Like, can we build it?
Does it
Like,
work?
so exactly. So like, if you're on a feature team, for example, like you're gonna talk to everybody. But if you're on like a more like design heavy team, or an engineering heavy team, that becomes a bit simplified. Now, with stakeholders, to me, like to define stakeholders for those that may not have that in their vocabulary
Okay.
outside of the product management space, right? Your stakeholders, like they could be an investor, right? They could be an
Ooh,
investor in the sense of like this person in your organization may make a decision that shuts down your team. That's a form of investment or divestment, right? Like,
yeah,
or they could make a decision that doubles the size of your team. So that's one stakeholder. Then there's the player, right? They're the person that's like at the end of the line that takes your product and decides whether they're gonna either spend time on it or pay for it or go talk about it with friends. Right?
yeah,
All of those things are very valuable or give you feedback on it. So like managing good stakeholders, I think, is understanding their motivations. Like what motivates each stakeholder? What do they want to hear about? And what do I have that's relevant to that? Like so from a player perspective, I'm sure they just want honesty. Hey, we're
mm,
trying to solve this problem. We have these hiccups. This is our intent. We hope it hits the mark. If not, let us know. Right. But like an investor type stakeholder that's looking to like either bump up the size of your team or shut it down, they want to know like, hey, when we create this, what value does it bring to the player? What value does it bring to the business? What value, sometimes in some cases, what value does it bring to me as an individual? And
yeah,
that's a reality that you deal with in an organization of humans. Right?
yes,
Some people are self-centric and they are in it for something of their own.
yeah.
And so as a product manager, you have to understand those nuances in your stakeholders.
I think this next question builds right off of that when talking about perspectives. But how important is empathy in your job?
Yeah. I think it's like super easy to go through this entire process without empathy, and that's
Yeah,
the toughest thing. Is like when you see that and you know it's just not going to work,
yeah,
right? Like you have to have empathy for the player first and foremost. Then you also have to have like empathy for the developers
yep,
and make sure that it's a sustainable process. So a lot of the time when players are waiting for something and they're like, "Why isn't this simple thing done yet?" And you're like, "Well, the developers have to deal with so much other stuff." And that empathy has to now kind of be shared in both spaces. And for me, as an org coach right now, right, like I'm pushing for both, right? Be empathetic towards your people on your team, and just be honest with the players as to why something is happening the way it is,
yep.
right? Like that's a really key part of it. But from a product manager perspective, to simplify that question, is you have to be you have to if I can talk, you have to be empathetic with the players. Sorry, it's almost 12 a.m. over here in Sweden. And part of that means just trying to put yourself in their shoes, and that's difficult sometimes because you're in so many different problem spaces. Sometimes you just don't know, so you reach out to other people on the team that do have that empathy, and you seek to understand by asking a lot of clarifying questions.
Yes, I love all that. Well, we've reached the end of our panel. Shaw, before we go, I want to give you first. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing so much knowledge with us today and educating us on this subject matter.
Of course, it's been an honor. I hope it
Yeah,
helped
it
a few
did.
people. Yeah,
I would love if you could shout out like where people can find you on the interwebs. Final words.
cool. Yeah, so leadingdevteams.com is my blog space. Write about a lot of this stuff. If you have topics you want to hear about, or just reach out to me and with any kind of questions, LinkedIn, right? Shahraman. I'll be the only Shahraman that's at Mojang, or that has been at Blizzard or Riot,
We love
most
that.
likely. So
We love.
yeah, easy
Thank
name.
you. Thank you so much to Shaw for teaching us so much. Reminder, we are still taking donations to our cause, Gamers Outreach on Tiltify, where you can register for the chance to win some awesome prizes. We have raised so far $700. Woo! That's
Nice.
awesome. Yeah, right? Be sure to check out our information below our stream, and you can hit the command donate or check out our Discord to find out more about how you can get involved. Now, a quick shout out to our partners today. We have Allmid. Allmid runs and supports nationally sponsored community, collegiate, and convention esports events across the US since 2015. Their esports teams are also currently ranked Division 1 top 10 in the North American field. Corsair, the leading global developer and manufacturer of high performance gear and technology for gamers, content creators, and PC enthusiasts. And Miami University. Miami University's game and simulations major with specialties in game art, game design, and game development provide individualized career pathways for success. They are a national leader in esports, including a new online master's degree in esports management. Now, we'll be back after a short commercial break with our community panel.